Hey guys, welcome back to Keys to the Cosmos. This is episode number 21 in my series Astrophotography Target Tips, and today we're talking about one of my very favorite targets. I know I say that in almost every video, but this one really is definitely, I would say, top 3 of emission nebula targets, and that is the Rosette Nebula. It's one of those targets, whether you're starting out, it's great for that. If you've shot it before, there's always other ways to shoot it. There's so much detail in it, so much beauty to pull out depending how you want to go about it, that I think this is definitely the kind of target that you could shoot over and over year after year. But it's definitely one of my very favorites. So we're going to talk all about it, how to locate it, framing it up, integration time, and some processing tips. And I have 2 versions of it at the end of this video. I'll have my regular version and then a starless version. So I hope that you guys enjoy that. Look forward to that at the end of the video. Now, I've actually shot the Rosette Nebula before. I've never made a video about it, but I shot it in December of 2020. And at that time, I was using my Star Adventure Star Tracker. I was using my modded DSLR, Astro modded DSLR, and I used my Sharpstar 76mm. So this time around, similar, I used my ASI 294 MC Pro astrophotography camera, but that has the same size sensor and APS-C as my DSLR did, and I used my Sharpstar 76mm again. I liked the framing of it, and I found that it gave me options when it came to cropping. So that was all the same as far as sensor size and the telescope, but I also used, of course, this time my Optron Go-To mount, and that made a big difference, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's a beautiful, fairly bright, good size nebula that I think if you've never shot it before, it's definitely on your must-shoot list either this year or next, depending when you're watching this. So let's talk about where to locate the Rosette Nebula. It's I can speak to experience. As I mentioned, I shot it before, and at that time I was finding things manually in the sky. It was fairly easy. I think it took me a few tries, but I did get it within, I would say, probably 20-30 minutes. But I'll give you some tips to help find it. Now, it's in the constellation Monoceros, which, at least in my terribly light-polluted skies, is definitely not one of those constellations where you look up and, oh, there it is, you know. Most of the stars are quite dim and hard to see in my Bordeaux 8.5/9 skies. So what I actually do is I use the constellation Orion. Everyone knows Orion, right? Obviously, one of the most recognizable and well-known constellations. But focus on that star at the top left called Betelgeuse. That's probably one of the brightest stars in Orion. It's a bright orange star, hard to miss. So if you focus on that top left star, Betelgeuse, and you go down and to the left, that's where the Rosette Nebula is. Now, it's one thing to say down and to the left, but on what angle, how far down? Of course, those are questions you're probably wondering. Well, what I did was I used a star called Procyon. And Procyon is, so if you go from Betelgeuse down on roughly like a 45, I mean, obviously we're not being super precise here, but roughly if you think of it that way, and go all the way down, there's another bright star, that's Procyon. You can't miss it, it's a white star. And at least it appears white in my skies, and it's also quite big and quite bright. So those are sort of the 2 stars that dominate that region of the sky. So once you found Betelgeuse and Procyon, if you draw a line through them, that sort of gives you your plane that you want to be on. And the Rosette Nebula is basically on that plane. It might be up or down. I can't remember. You'd have to check stellarium exactly, but it's very close to being right on plane between those 2 stars. And then to help you even more, so if you're going down from Procyon up to Betelgeuse, you want to go past halfway. I would say maybe not quite 3/4, but just under 3/4, and that's where the Rosette Nebula. So if you have like a laser pointer or something, say if you're finding this manually, and you point it right on that plane between those 2 stars, and about 3/4 of the way up, you should be find a piece of it. If not, you'll be right in the vicinity. You just have to make small adjustments to find it. But I really didn't have too hard a time. And obviously this time with my Go-To, it wasn't an issue. But if you are finding it manually, it's fairly easy to find. As I mentioned, it's fairly bright, magnitude 9. Not crazy bright, but in my opinion, it seems brighter than that. I'm not questioning them, but it does seem to pop out even with my Astro modded DSLR in like a 30-second exposure. So once you find it, you'll know. It's immediately recognizable, and you'll know you have the shot, and then you just have to make adjustments to get it centered. So let's move into framing. Framing, talk more about what you should use to shoot this when it comes to framing, because obviously you want to get it centered. Now you have a few options. In my opinion, anywhere from 250mm to about 500 is that sweet spot for this. So on the low end of that, 250, you're talking about like a Red Cat 51. It's going to appear quite small, but you'll still see it. You can still pull out some detail. If you spend long enough on integration time, you'll be able to do a fairly large crop and then still get in nice and close. But definitely, if that's all you have is like a large camera lens or a Red Cat 51, something like that, go ahead. You don't need a ton of focal length for this target. My Sharp Star, as I mentioned, was really nice. It had sort of the Rosette. I'll show a single exposure shortly. Rosette with a little bit of space, so you can shoot it sort of medium wide field, call it medium wide field. Or again, if you spend enough time, you can sort of crop right in and get really close and see a lot of those details. And then you could go all the way up to something like a 100 millimeter telescope with like 500-ish millimeters of focal length. And then you can get pretty close. Then now you're starting to go for specific detail in it. And then you can really do crops to just isolate certain key parts of that target and whatever it is that you want to really highlight in your picture. So there's lots of options. You could also shoot it super wide field and include the monkey head. I think that's the nebula that's closest to it. Either that or the what's it called? The jellyfish nebula. I can't remember, but I'll put here. I've seen pictures of that with the two of them. I believe it is the monkey head. So you can shoot it that way with wide field, maybe 135 millimeter camera lens, something like that, and then you can get two nebula in the picture. Up to you what you want to do, but as I mentioned, it's one of those targets you can shoot multiple times and do something a little different every time. Let's talk about integration time. So as I mentioned, I've shot this before. Here's the picture here. This was, I believe, 4 hours worth using 60-second exposures. And as I mentioned, my DSLR and Sharp Star 76 millimeter. I mean, at the time I was blown away. I thought it was an amazing image. At least for my capabilities at the time, I was really proud of it. Now I look back, it's oversaturated. I really left out a lot of details, too much color, the way it was done, and all that. But still, for 5 to 6 months into the hobby, I was happy with that. This next one, my newest one, you'll see is definitely different. A lot less saturation, a lot less color. But this time around, I got 5 hours, so not a whole lot more. Unfortunately, we just haven't had the best weather. What else is new? So between that and busy schedule, wasn't able to get out a whole lot. So I think I got out two separate nights and got about 5 hours of integration time. But one of the biggest differences was my exposure time. So here's a single exposure. This is 3 minutes unguided using my Optron Go-To mount. So you can see it's very distinguishable. There's no questioning if you have it. Once you have it, you can see that's the Rosette Nebula. It has that distinct shape. Some of those, even in a single exposure, I was pretty blown away by how you could see, some of those strands of dust and stuff like that. Just for fun, I actually processed that single exposure because I was so blown away by, how clear it was. And this is the picture here, which is not bad at all. There's not too many targets I did it in my last video with M1, the Crab Nebula, but there's not too many targets where you can process a single 3 minute unguided exposure and still get, I'm not going to say a good picture, obviously, but clearly see what it is, get some color, get some detail. So that's why I say I really love the Rosette Nebula. And if you're just starting out, this isn't a great target to focus on. So yeah, I got 5 hours total time. I would say if you're, this is one of those ones that you can definitely do somewhere around, as I showed, a 3 minute, you can get a decent picture if you're able to shoot 3 minute exposures. But say you're shooting shorter exposures, maybe 60 seconds, 2 minutes, anywhere between 2 and 3 hours will get you a really nice picture. No doubt about it. You'll be able to see it clearly, you'll be able to get details, and I think you'll be happy with it, especially if you're just starting out. But if you really want to pull out details, I would say that 5 hour mark is sort of where you want to be, plus. As I always say, there's amazing 20-hour pictures of just about everything out there. But this definitely isn't one of those targets where you need to spend that amount of time. You can get out there, if you plan it right, one solid night, and you can have a picture the next day. That's what I love about the Rosette Nebula. You don't have to sink a ton of time into it, and you can still pull out a lot of beautiful details. So there it is. You see my single exposure. I was really happy with that, and I was excited to be able to get some time on it and see what I could pull out of it. So let's talk about processing. Processing, this is one of those ones again where it depends how crazy you want to go with it. If you have enough focal length and you are going to crop in like I did on both versions, particularly my starless version, I really cropped even more. But even on my other one, I really wanted to focus on the details of this beautiful nebula. So I did a lot of lassoing, let's just put it that way. In my last video on M1, I said it was one of those targets you just lassoed it and worked on as a whole. This one, not at all. In fact, just the opposite. I did work it on as a whole, but I also lassoed off tons of sections of the image separately and just tried to pull them out. The whole goal, in my opinion, with the Rosette, you want to get a sense of depth. It has that sort of hole in the middle. It almost looks like you could travel into it. And with my image, I wanted to get that sense of depth. And the key to doing that is having different textures. The bigger things, sort of, you're trying to give the impression that are closer to the person looking at the photo. I wanted more texture, more clarity. And then some of those soft gas in the background, you wanted to have it softer. So there's where you get your depth, and there's where it appears that you're looking in instead of just like a 2D picture. And so that's, anyway, was the goal. I think overall I achieved it for the most part, but I'll give you some few tips on how to do that. So we're talking about all the usual stuff. We're talking about stretching it, levels adjustment, all that. You should find that it starts to pop out fairly quickly. And then there are a few key areas that will start to blow out that you got to be careful. That's when you know you're stretching it too much and you got to stop, and maybe even undo or delete certain layers to make sure that you don't want to blow out areas. You can focus on them later individually. So once you're happy with the way it's sort of come out, as always, I lasso the whole thing off. There's some interpretation here because there is surrounding gas depending how much integration time you have. So whether you want to include that and when you lasso off that first time, up to you. I did include some of it. I ended up cropping a lot of it out just because I kind of changed my mind and went for more of a deep crop. But if you're going to leave it a little bit further out and you want some space around it, decide how much of that gas you want to include, and then the rest will sort of melt into the background with the rest of space. So once it's lassoed off, select inverse, get that background looking good, smooth and all that, and then unselect that, and now you're working on the target itself. And then camera raw filter, as we talk about in every video, and just start pulling it out a little bit more. Once you're happy with the way it looks overall, that's when I start doing my lassoing off. And there's certain key areas that I want to focus on. So here's my original picture. We'll use that. It's harder to tell in this one because it is so full of color and a little bit saturated, but I'll try to point out a few key areas. Like there's sort of now again, depends on your configuration, whether it's the bottom or it's the top, so keep that in mind. But assuming yours is somewhat like mine here, that bottom part, there's like a thick row of gas that I lassoed off. And again, as I always do in camera raw filter, texture, clarity, maybe a little bit of contrast just to really pull that out. And there's some nice detail in there that you can pull out. And again, that's sort of being on more of the forefront of the picture as opposed to the background, the deeper part of it. There's a couple key areas as well. There's the Rosette. If you ever see this strand of dust, even if it's on a real crazy zoomed in crop version, it's the Rosette Nebula. It's so distinctive to this target. I love that piece of dust or gas, whatever it is, that goes through it. And I love to be able to bring that out. So that I lassoed off. I followed it all along, and I lassoed it off. And again, camera raw filter, texture, clarity, black level. I really wanted to pop that out as much as I could. And there's another part in the top right of that picture, and again, dark piece of dust or gas, and I lassoed that off, and same thing as I treated that other strand that goes through it. Texture, clarity, contrast, all those things. So now you're starting to get depth to the picture. Now you're starting to get really beautiful details. And then another thing I did was in the sort of center, you see where it's hard to tell in this picture, but there's sort of a lighter gas, the softer stuff, that I actually even lassoed off that. And I went to camera raw filter, and on the third tab, there's something called luminance. Here's a picture of that tab. Again, camera raw filter in this tab, and I just lowered the luminance just to give it a bit of a softer feel. And that sort of contrasted the more sharp areas that I talked about earlier. So that's where I kind of got that contrast. I also went to exposure. I've talked about this in other videos. As that was lassoed off in exposure, there's one called gamma. I forget what it's called. I'll have it here. Gamma correction, I think. And I just slightly lowered that. So put the slider to the left, and it just gives it more of a soft, almost like whitish pink look. So again, we're going for contrast. We don't want the whole thing to look pink or red or whatever. We're trying to get contrasting colors without it looking like it's been tampered with too much. So that was the main things that I did. And then, as always, I just sort of lassoed it off and made my final adjustments. But those are the main things. Play with those details. See what you can pull out of it. See if you can get that sort of depth in the image. It makes it so much more beautiful and so much more engaging when people look at it. Now, I want to talk quickly about the starless version. So what I did was, I didn't start a new one for the starless. I know I've talked about doing that before, but in this case I didn't. I basically took that image when I was done. I put in the StarNet++. We've talked about that. I have a video on it. If you haven't watched that, it's super easy to use and it's free. So you can't go wrong there. And it pops out a starless version. There's some corrections always to make. Some of them, sometimes when it removes the star, it leaves like a purplish circle. I went through, I fixed all that with the eraser in Photoshop. And then, as I've talked about before, it always looks a little bit soft when it pops out that image starless. So again, started lassoing off those key areas, really brought them out, played with the color, temperature, vibrance, all that. And again, I just wanted to give that sense of depth, and I cropped it even more. So now you're really like the edges of the Rosette Nebula itself are right to the edge of the picture. And I was happy with the way that came out too. You know me, I love my starless images, so I knew I wanted to do one with the Rosette. So it didn't take too long. That was a much shorter edit or processing after the main picture was done. So now I have two beautiful pictures of Rosette, and they're both beautiful in different ways. For the second one, the starless, I went a little bit softer, a little bit cooler colors, a little bit more pink as opposed to red, and not so vibrant. But again, two different versions, and maybe I'll do a third one day, who knows, when it's really cloudy. But happy with both of them. I hope this helps you guys. It's an amazing target. I didn't talk about my filter. I should have mentioned that. Now I use my Radian Triad Ultra filter. I talked about in the last video in M1, the Crab Nebula. Amazing filter, and that always helps with processing. So I have to keep that in mind and mention that. If you're using a DSLR and just a light suppression filter, it's not going to be so vibrant. It's not going to be so obvious, in a single exposure. But that doesn't mean that you can't still make an amazing picture. If you're able to, even something like the Optolong L Extreme, that's a great filter. It's a little bit cheaper, obviously, than the Triad Ultra. But get a decent filter. That's so important if you're in light polluted sky. It's going to make your processing so much easier. I can't highlight that enough. Don't invest in a crazy expensive telescope, in my opinion. The mount's important, obviously, but the camera, even, I would, if you're really limited funds, more and more I see how important a really good filter is, especially if you're in light polluted skies. It makes such a difference. So, guys, I can't highlight that enough. It's going to make your processing a lot easier too. So, something to keep in mind. But that's everything for the Rosette Nebula. I hope you enjoy it, and I got a lot more coming. I got some equipment on the way. Looking forward to sharing that with you. It's been some delays, but it's finally arriving soon. So, can't wait to share that with you and a lot more. Until the next one, guys, take care.